right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to all of our guests here today in person and online. My name is Carrie Bingen. I'm the director of the Aerospace Security Project here at the Center for International and I should know my own organization, Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'll be your MC this morning, and then we're privileged to have General J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations and Distinguished Senior Advisor at CSIS, who will be your afternoon Master of Ceremonies. December 20th, 2024 marks the 5th anniversary of the establishment of the U.S. Space Force, the first military service created in 72 years. Today, we celebrate the Space Force and its guardians, reflect on how the service came about, and discuss its future. There's a colleague here who I won't name, but I remember her saying, you know, space is so important to national security, our economic prosperity, that we now need a military service to protect and defend our interests like we do in the air, at sea, etc. Dr. John Hamre, President and CEO of CSIS, could not be here in person today, but he did want to extend his welcome. So let's cue that up.
Good morning, everybody. This is John Hamre, and I'm sorry I can't be with you at this great conference today. I have to be out on the West Coast, but I did want to say words of welcome to everybody, and I'm really pleased and proud that we're able to host this conference on the U.S. Space Force. First, let me say thank you to Lockheed Martin that's given us the resources to be able to pull this conference together, but we're very grateful for that. But my goodness, what a powerful lineup of speakers. I really want to say thanks to Chairman Mike Rogers for being with us. He, about 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, gave a tectonic speech. It was earth-shaking. He was out at the aerospace conference in Denver and said he thought we needed an independent Space Force, and he started the great debate that unfolded and ultimately led to the creation of the Space Force 5 years ago now. And so we're really delighted that he's here, and it's really great that he's with us. I want to say special thanks to J. Raymond. General J. Raymond was the first, he was the inaugural commander for the Space Force, and he just did a terrific job of lining that up and was a good friend. So we played a modest role at CSIS. We tried to host workshops and dinners that helped lay the foundation, but it's really, Jay, I want to thank you for what you did, and you really did create the wonderful foundation for the Space Force. General Saltzman, thank you for being with us today. You're now the commander for the Space Force, and we're looking forward to hearing your accounting of where we're heading. And because this is not a conference looking backwards, it's a conference looking forward. And I'm really pleased that Gwynne Shotwell is here. You know, nobody has revolutionized space in modern times like SpaceX. And she's the president, chief operating officer for SpaceX. And, you know, I mean, it's a profound change. We're seeing the transformation of space and an incredible explosion of opportunity in space, some danger too that'll come with it. I'm sure we'll be talking about both of those things today. So I want to say a hearty thanks to you all. We also have Congressman Jim Cooper with us. Jim was Mike Rogers, you know, co-pilot, you know, shared the entire journey in creating the Space Force. And Jim, it's great to have you with us, and thank you. We miss you in the Congress, but we're delighted that you're joining us here today. Let me say thanks to Frank Calvelli, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition. And I'm told that Air Marshal Paul Godfrey is with us. He was the UK Space Chief. And, you know, so this is going to be a great conference. I really am sorry I can't be there, but I do want to say thank you to all and look forward to hearing the reports on what I know will be a very powerful review of the history of the Space Force and, more importantly, where we're going. So thank you all for joining us today. And let me turn it to Carrie Bingen. Carrie Bingen has been a tremendous resource for us creating our aerospace program at CSIS. So, Carrie, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Hamre. I would also like to echo his thanks. We have superb speakers joining us today, Space Force and defense leaders, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, industry leaders, and we end the day with next generation voices in national security space. We have a packed agenda. I hope you'll find the panel stimulating. I think you'll hear some things for the first time, including from our first panel on how the Space Force came to be. I also want to thank Lockheed Martin. I see Robert Lightfoot and Marcel Lettre here. Your donation enabled us to host this event today. Why is this important? Such donations allow us to host events that are free for young guardians, civilians, students, and the public to attend. We need our next generation engaged, thinking critically about the challenges we face, and willing to join our community to help solve them. We also want the public to further understand what the Space Force does and why it was created. So for all of our participants, I encourage you to ask questions of the speakers. You can submit those questions via the event website or the QR code that you see displayed here. You'll also note several breaks today. We did that intentionally. We want you to interact, share your perspectives and ideas. For those attending in person, stick with us through the day. We have a networking reception at the end of the day thanks to the support of Alera Nova. Especially for our younger folks in the room, take advantage of these breaks and these networking opportunities. I'd now like to turn it over to Mr. Robert Lightfoot, President of Lockheed Martin Space, for some opening remarks and to introduce our first fireside chat. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's certainly an honor to be here today for this first-of-a-kind event hosted by CSIS. And be among so many distinguished leaders. Carrie mentioned several of those folks. My deepest gratitude to Carrie, Bingham, and John Hamry for their leadership and commitment to advancing international interest across the space sector. Your work has really been pivotal to all that we've become here and a part of Space Force and how it's playing into our ecosystem now more than it ever has. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. As a proud partner of the Space Force, Lockheed Martin is privileged to support the critical mission that our Guardians are taking on every day, and really to celebrate this important milestone. I think we're here today as we think about the need for robust capabilities in space. Think where we were 5 years ago. And so for that, I think we should just give a round of applause to the Space Force for what they've accomplished in 5 years. You know, as we all know, there's still a lot more to do. And today is one example of how we can continue to engage in the substantive discussions around what needs to be done. We find ourselves in an environment where space has become a contested domain, a dynamic and rapidly evolving field where the stakes are incredibly high. The threats we face in space are real, tangible, and emerging faster than many of us probably expected. What does a day without space look like? It's not just the loss of navigation or communication or financial systems in the world. It's the loss of the capabilities that provide our warfighters with the strategic edge. Also, space is much more complex than many have been led to believe. And when I say space, I mean the domain, I mean industry as a whole, and I mean the larger industrial base for this nation. There are unique challenges of operating in space, and even the cyber resiliency and complex nature of these systems cannot be understated. To remain secure and a global leader, we must be prepared to respond to these very real challenges with speed, innovation, and collaboration. So what does that all mean to us? You know, first, the collaboration between the U.S. government and industry is more critical than ever before. Strengthening partnerships, not just within the aerospace community, but across the entire supply chain and across the entire industrial base for our nation, is essential to ensuring that we can keep pace with these emerging challenges and threats. The challenges we face in space are complex, and our ability to respond requires innovation, not just in technology, but how we work together. This means looking at things differently and with a sense of urgency. The speed at which technology in space is evolving outpaces the traditional processes that we follow. to ensure that we acquire and deploy new technologies, simplifying our acquisition processes, removing some bureaucratic barriers, and enabling rapid integration of new solutions is how we're going to get there. I applaud Secretary Calvelli for the things he's trying to do with his tenets of acquisition, where he's really trying to change the dynamic as we move forward. To truly succeed, we must build a defense and technology ecosystem, not just the traditional providers, but bring in the commercial technology, bring in the commercial applications that we can use for certain parts of the defense of our space endeavor that we have. By leveraging the strengths of all these stakeholders, we can ensure that the public-private partnerships deliver fully integrated mission solutions that seamlessly operate across all platforms. And when we look to the future, we need to remember that space is a place for everyone. And many of those leaders are in this room joining us online today, or joining us online today. I'm inspired by what we're already seeing from the workforce of the future. I like to talk about the workforce of the future as born digital. I'm born analog. And they bring together so much more capability, so much more advanced knowledge when they come into this workforce, and we need them working in space. We need that workforce part of our ecosystem so they can continue to address what I think is the next industrial revolution, the use and protection of space. Later today, we'll have the opportunity to hear from our next generation panel, and I encourage everyone, no matter their level of experience, to engage in these dialogues. Senior professionals, your mentorship is invaluable. Junior professionals and students, you are the future, and your challenges and opportunities in space that we weren't even thinking about when I was in your position. I'm excited for your future and what you'll get to do as we move forward in this area. So as we officially begin today's discussions, I want to challenge each of you to think differently about the future of space. There's a true sense of purpose in all the panel discussions that have been curated for today's event. And the future of space is not something that happens to us. It's something that we can control and we can own. You've all heard the statement, there's three types of people in this world. There's those that make things happen, those that watch things happen, and those that go, what happened? We need to make things happen, and I believe that we will. Problems we face in space are complex, but they're not insurmountable. So with that, I have the pleasure of introducing the next discussion. Our first keynote discussion today is titled Acting Boldly. And I know that these two will help set the tone to do just that. First, we have Congressman Mike Rogers, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and from the great state of Alabama. I am biased because that's where I'm from too. As a fellow Alabamian. Through his role on the committee, he's actively advocated for the need to align resources and efforts countering our advantages in space. And frankly, as Carrie said, was one of the originators of the Space Force. Joining Congressman Rogers after some opening remarks will be Sarah Mineiro, Senior Associate of the Aerospace Security Project and the founder and CEO of Dengara Enterprises. She brings a unique perspective from working across the space industry and having led the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. Please join me in welcoming Representative Rogers to the stage, and then Sarah afterwards.
Thank you for that, and thank y'all for having me here today. And I want to thank Carrie Bingen and CSIS for pulling this event together. It's good to see my friend Jay Raymond here and my buddy Jim Cooper over here. And I understand General Saltzman will be here soon. But now y'all keep an eye on Cooper. He's writing a book about the creation of the Space Force, and he's liable to get a hold of you. He wants you on the record, so you don't be quoted. Don't get close to him. This is quite the moment, and it's hard to believe 5 years have passed since we created the Space Force. The period of time around its creation was certainly unique, complete with a Netflix series that poked fun at it and jokes being made by folks who are not in our world. Well, that TV series is gone, and so are the jokes. People have come to realize the very real threats that exist in space and the compelling need for a Space Force. As I reflect back on this new service and how it came about, I think about that 2017 Space Symposium, where I stood at a podium like this and laid out the case for why we needed a Space Force. And I know many of you were there that day. You thought I was smoking marijuana, didn't you? It's legal in Colorado. But in that speech, I talked about many of the problems the space mission was experiencing at that point in time. Problems with promotion rates, acquisition programs, budgets, and decision-making for space-related personnel and assets. I presented an org chart on space, which became known by many as the kudzu chart. It depicted bureaucratically mismatched lines and authority, responsibility, and accountability. This was all happening at a time when our reliance on space and on the threats to our space systems were growing rapidly, as was a budding commercial space ecosystem. So where are we today? The trends we saw then have significantly accelerated. There has been a roughly 400% increase in the number of satellites, driven primarily by the commercial sector. Tens of billions of dollars of private investment are fueling bold innovation. And the fabric of space is extending deeper into the joint force as well as our daily lives. I believe we are entering a new Apollo-like era for space, and I'm excited about the future. But I'm also concerned. China and Russia have not been idle during this period of time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine started with cyber attacks on commercial space ground infrastructure. This was followed by persistent GPS jamming, demonstrating what many of us had warned about for years. The future conflicts will extend into space. No adversary understands this better than China. China has continued an unprecedented run to deploy systems on orbit designed to remove our space advantages. They will also enable the Chinese military to track and target our joint force. General Saltzman recently described this pace of Chinese activity as mind-boggling, and they show no sign of slowing down anytime in the near future. So, Space Force has its work cut out for it, but they're not going alone. Congress will be a partner. We will continue providing policies and resources to ensure the U.S. is leading and strengthening our posture in space. So let's get to some of the areas of focus as we look to the future. First, I want to start with people. I'll be blunt. The Space Force needs to grow. When we stood up to service, we called for a small, agile force. At that time, the focus was on getting them on their feet and running. We addressed issues like having their own budget, their own personnel, and their own promotion structure. We've come a long way since those early tasks. But now it's time to increase the size of the force to meet the growing threats. This increase needs to include both enlisted and civilian guardians, as well as junior officers and general officers. I know some of my friends in Congress are violently opposed to any growth as just increasing overhead. But if we want the Space Force capable of doing what the nation expects, it has to have enough people and the right people to carry out its mission. Now, I'm not advocating for wholesale increase in end strength. Everyone is going to have to give a little out of what we currently have. Congress should authorize more general officers. The Air Force should also transfer some of their billets to the Space Force, and the Secretary of Defense should transfer additional billets from his pool. But as we push to increase the size of the Space Force, we must also make sure we are developing our guardians. When it comes to guardians, it's about quality and quantity. We need to give them the skills they need to support a technology-driven force. Both General Saltzman and General Raymond have done a great job building a warfighting culture and normalizing space as a part of the joint fight. Nonetheless, we have more work to do. 7 years ago, the general officer promotion status for the Air Force revealed almost all those promoted were fighter pilots. As I look to the future of the Space Force, I'm going to be watching these statistics to ensure the Space Force isn't making the same mistake. The Space Force has to be led by more than just operators. It must recognize the contributions of all career services if it's to be successful. A deep understanding and connection with technology is at the core of the Space Force. Operators, acquisition, intel, and cyber professionals all must be on equal footing. The future of the Space Force will depend on its ability to both nurture these unique specialties and tribes while also creating a unified fighting force. And I don't want you to get me wrong. I agree that growing and building space operators is critically important, but the development of acquisition and other professionals is just as important. After all, what are these operators going to operate if acquirers aren't acquiring the newest and latest technology? For the Space Force, the Joint Force, for the Space Force and the Joint Force to succeed, we must have guardians that are just as comfortable operating in space as they are breaking down a requirements document, which leads me to budget and acquisitions. As mentioned, General Saltzman has talked about a mind-boggling growth of national security threats in space. In this threat environment, we expect the Space Force to perform two major missions. The first is to enable the Joint Force. The second is to protect and defend our interest in, to, and from space. This second mission in particular is no small task, and the growth in mission must come with a growth in budget. Space warfighting is a highly technical affair, but don't expect Congress just to throw money at doing things the way we have in the past. We must approach acquisition differently. We can no longer afford 8+ years to develop requirements and conduct long, drawn-out competition processes. Nor can we afford the endless cost-plus development contracts. Fortunately, progress has been made. Secretary Cavelli, for his part, has worked to expedite things by emphasizing fixed-price contracts. And the Space Development Agency has taken advantages of many of the acquisition methods authorized by Congress for just this purpose. Our commercial space sector, the envy of the world, is investing billions in new infrastructure and manufacturing. This includes modern technologies such as AI, autonomy, and more. Everyone is moving a little bit in the right direction, but it's not quite enough. The department must be more agile and continue to use every lever that has been given to it by Congress to increase competition in these programs, to minimize requirement changes, buy commercial, and find ways to partner and draw more non-traditional companies into the defense market. To be clear, this is not a problem with one solution, but it is a problem that can be solved with hard work and creativity. It's going to take a concerted effort from all sides to get capabilities into the hands of the warfighters faster. We need it all: more competition, better requirements, agile acquisitions, efficient programs, and on-time appropriations. So, we've talked about people, budget, capabilities, and acquisition. Now let's talk about the policies that drive it all. As has been said so many times that it's become cliche, operating in space is very different than operating in any of the other domains. The testing and training protocols that are tried and true for a new ground combat system, or an F-16, is not an option for space systems. Guardians typically cannot take these systems out for a spin and get comfortable with how they operate during peacetime. The Space Force needs to develop tactics, techniques, and procedures that they then turn into training courses for future Guardians. Many of the limiting factors that contribute to this disconnect come from the demands of distance and the space domain itself. We must do our best to establish the test ranges, realistic simulators, and capabilities we need to ensure our dominance in space. The remaining limitations are self-imposed. My hope is that the incoming Trump administration will take a hard look at some of the policies that limit our Guardians' test and how they test and train in orbit. I believe there's room to allow the service to get better experience operating in space while also maintaining norms and behaviors that we have here in the U.S. upheld for decades. Which brings me to my final point. We must continue to aggressively push the many policy and classification barriers that remain as relics of the Cold War. Here, I'll take a moment to commend the work of Dr. John Plumb. During his time in space policy, he began some of this hard work, but there's a lot more to do. There are presidential policy directives, Defense Department directives, joint staff instructions, and on that need updating. Many of these documents never considered more players in space than the U.S. and Russia, much less the existence of a space force. We have to address this so that the public better understands the threats and investments we need to make and to mitigate these threats. Looking forward, General Saltzman has to develop new concepts guiding the Space Force, such as competitive endurance. This includes a key tenet for the need to be able to conduct responsible counter space campaigning. It challenged the Guardians to understand what systems we need to disrupt and deny an adversary's space-based targeting. This is important work that we must tackle if we are to be successful and continue to develop Guardians that can protect and defend our national interest in space. These policy changes are at the heart of what we must do to establish deterrence, integrate with the joint force, conduct training, and develop a warfighting doctrine. In closing, the continued changes in Space Force personnel acquisition and policy that I've outlined here today have important principles in the Space Force. We have to maximize our asymmetric advantages to ensure Americans' continued space superiority. We cannot stand still. When we started, we knew it wasn't just about how many Guardians and platforms we have in space, but the quality of those Guardians and platforms. In my 2017 speech, referring to the Space Force, I said, it must be as world-class as our Army, our Navy, our Marines, our Air Force. In fact, it must be as good as the University of Alabama football program before Nick Saban left. And I'm proud to say y'all are living up to that. Let's keep working. Thank you for what you've done. Happy birthday, Space Force, and roll tide.
I got you. I think in my entire career of knowing Chairman Mike Rogers, he has never ended a conversation in any other way than roll tide. Had a lot of conversations with this gentleman. What a great way to start the day. I can't believe it's been 5 years since the establishment of the Space Force, and so much has changed, and quite frankly, so much has stayed the same. Yeah. I have more gray hair. You look exactly the same. It's good, good to go. I've had the pleasure of working for you in the past, and on my best days, I feel like I still do. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Boss, let's just get a little level down on the discussion that you just had. You talked and you started your speech in exactly the right place, in the people, both the quantity and the quality of the people and the Guardians, and developing the right mix of Guardians. What does that look like to you? Can you just explain and walk us through a little bit more what you'd like to see that mix look like, what the areas of emphasis should be?
Well, you have to go think back when Jim Cooper and I were first realizing we had to do something. What brought our attention to the concerns in the space mission was the inability for acquisitions to move in a timely fashion. It was literally taking 6-8 years for people to make a decision in the Air Force, get a contract in place, and by the time the platform was built, typically it was so big and exquisite and expensive that it was problematic, but it was also dated. So, you know, I've stayed focused on that need to go fast, and Jay Raymond can tell you that was the thing that I talked to him about when he first took the job, and the same thing with General Saltzman is you have to go fast. And so that's why, you know, after we've gotten past this initial phase of standing it up, I wanted to remember that was the reason that we initially saw the problem, is they've got a golden opportunity to start with a clean sheet of paper with an acquisition and build an acquisition system that's state-of-the-art and demonstrate it doesn't have to be bureaucratic and cumbersome and slow to be an acquisition system. It can be fast and agile and modern, and demonstrate to the other services this is the way you do it. It can be done. So that's kind of why I talk about that now. But we had to really get the service stood up first before we could turn a lot of attention to it.
Yeah, I mean, and this really leads me to, again, one of my most favorite nerdtastic kinds of areas of expertise, which is space acquisition. And you talk about that, and it's quite frankly the theme of this entire discussion that you had earlier. There's a lot of questions, and there were, when we were thinking about and developing how the Space Force would be stood up, the question was, should Space Force have its own acquisition pathway? Can it work within the existing acquisition pathways? 5 years on, do you think that the Space Force has all of the tools and resources necessary to fulfill its mandate?
I do. I think it needs to stay focused, and we're about to push a lot of resources toward it. Secretary Kendall came to see me and Adam Smith, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, a couple of months ago, to let us know he needs to double the size of the Space Force over the next 5 years. I mean, the threats are really pretty incredible that are growing by our adversaries. And that was another part of why we felt like we had to pull the space mission out of the Air Force, is it needed to develop a culture around excellence and dominance in space that was never going to be nurtured in a force that was air domain focused. So we had to get that out, but now we really do have to see that attentive focus to fast acquisition and making sure it does not get burdened. One of the concerns I've got, and this is, everybody in this room is going to know this happens in other services, is when we put out a invitation for companies to bid, we can't be changing the requirements after we pick a winner. You know, this stuff can never end, and that's the kind of thing I want the Space Force to be very careful about. Go ahead, decide what a threat is, invite folks to come up with a platform that will deal with that threat, buy the one that's best, move on it, and if we have something else that needs to be done, let's then do that. I'd like to see attritable assets that we can, particularly in this domain where technology is advancing so quickly, we don't need to get bogged down, and that's exactly what the other services have, and I worry about that creep coming over into the Space Force, and it hasn't so far, but we're very, very attentive to that. Okay.
One of the things that you just kind of talked about, and you mentioned in your speech as well, was classification. And back in the day, about 5-6 years ago, you used to always tell people, everybody is about one threat brief away from really getting behind the Space Force, from really understanding what is going on. And you and Ranking Member Jim Cooper at the time really worked with the department to figure out how we could start talking more openly about space. And you mentioned the great work that John Plum has done on that. Where are we now with that? Is that going to be continuing to be a point of emphasis that we're going to need to continue to work on? And how do you see that contributing to kind of the Space Force's mission?
it's a big obstacle, and it always has been. Anybody that's dealt with the department knows they overclassify everything. And it's cultural. They're not bad people. It's just the way they do things, and they don't want to change. The problem we're having, and you heard me make reference to when we stood up the Space Force, the Netflix series and all the jokes. People had no clue what the Space Force was. They thought we were sending Captain Kirk up, and they didn't understand about satellites and the critical role they play. That's just because it's so overclassified. So, one of the ways for us to help not just the public, the members of Congress who we need to help pay for this stuff, to understand what we're doing is you got to declassify a lot of stuff. Cooper and I used to go into the SCIF to get briefings along with our staff, and literally over half of what they were showing us was in the public domain already, either on TV or in articles, and it's insane. And then General Hyten used to make the point, we want our adversaries to know a little bit more about what we can do to them. Maybe they'll behave better. So there's a lot of reasons for us to change this. And when General Hyten went into the Pentagon as vice chairman, this was one of his goals. He found out it's a lot harder to change than he thought it would be. So I say all that to say this is going to be a continuing effort. We have to stay after it. It's not something you can focus on one day or 1 week or 1 month. You have to continue it, and we're going to get there. Fortunately, there's been some heightened awareness in the public about what Space Force really is, and that it is about satellites and how much they're entrenched in our lives. But it could be so much easier if we could just get this classification system brought to the 21st century.
So the theme of today is not just celebrating the amazingness that Space Force was, the hard path that it took to be created, but also looking forward and acting boldly. But let's just humor ourselves for a little bit. It was extremely challenging to go through and think about critically the problems that we were trying to solve, how we were going to solve them, and then possibly getting the Senate on board. But everybody got there in the end because it was the right thing to do. Are there any kind of personal stories that you want to share about how hard fought that path was, about, that can also help us to think about the optimism of where we're going in the future?
Yeah, the hard part's behind us. Y'all have to read Cooper's book to find out all the machinations. This was a very difficult baby to birth. Let me put it that way. It took a good long time for us to. It wasn't hard for us to get it through the House, trying to deal with the Senate. And, the department didn't want to do it. The Air Force didn't want to do it. So they were going to the Senate trying to stop it. And fortunately, we had a very disruptive president at the time who was very helpful to us at getting this done. I say that to say, it was hard to stand up, but now, it has overwhelming bipartisan support. There's very few things in the Congress right now that has the kind of support the Space Force does from both sides of the aisle. Initially, there were some on the other side of the aisle, the Democrat side, because Trump embraced it. Well, it has to be bad, but they got past that real fast. Adam Smith and Jim Cooper were huge helps in helping him understand this is not Trump's idea. This came along first. But Trump was a critical component to kicking that final door down to create it. But now that that's done, it's all about making sure it grows and matures. As I told folks after we finally got it stood up, we had to worry then about people trying to kill the baby in the crib. Well, now it's maturing now, and it's going to be getting into its adolescence pretty soon. So we have to keep nurturing it, keep paying attention to it, helping it grow and be healthy. And I see us doing that. I think it's on a great path forward. But we cannot take our eyes off these little details I'm talking about, like acquisition, because, again, it has to go fast. It can never become like the Army. And keep in mind, we have the finest Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force in the world. All of them will complain about their acquisition system. The platforms that we use in space, the technology is advancing so quickly, it cannot get bogged down like that. So that's why you hear me focusing on this acquisition and nurturing and growing acquisition professionals in this service as being particularly important.
We have time for maybe one or two questions that are coming in from the audience, and so I'm going to just kind of rattle those off. Once upon a time ago, in a very appropriate kind of metaphor, we talked about the establishment language of the Space Force being like a Christmas tree, right? A framework that we would literally hold, kind of hang things on as it continued to grow. As a mother of two adolescents, I think that the Space Force is probably on its path of growing and maturing probably better than my children at this point. I love you, kids. I love you. They're small. They're not watching this. They're at school. But again, when you talk about growing more people, the culture, the resources, and developing those guardians, there's a lot of discussion out there in the press about pulling the Space Force out from underneath the Air Force and into a separate department. I know this is something that we had talked about at the original establishment. Looking forward in thinking about acting boldly, is this something that you think is going to happen? The timelines, what is the expectation for that?
Yeah, I don't see that happening in the near future. You know, when we were first trying to figure out how to stand, and she's right, I kept describing to everybody, it's like standing up a Christmas tree. You don't have a fully decorated tree. First thing you got to do is stand the tree up. Then you layer on some ornaments, then some more ornaments, then some lights, and yada, yada, yada. And what we were doing initially, we were just standing the tree up. Well, there was discussion, do we take it out of the Department of the Air Force and leave it in like the Navy and the Marines? That was the preference of me and Jim Cooper, is we wanted to just for the economies of staying in the department and to be as least disruptive as possible, because this was disruptive enough. And I still think it's probably, given its size, it's fine of where it is, and it may stay that way. If it ever becomes a problem, you know, I think we can address it then. But I think that's off in the future. I will tell you an interesting little thing that happened when Pat Shanahan was the Deputy Secretary of Defense when we stood this up. And he was hugely important, just a critical player in this, a guy with a corporate background who did not mind change and was helped bring that to the department. But when we were standing up, he wanted to bring the IC community in. And I was like, whoa, let's not do that. And he could not understand. While we're doing, let's do it all, let's do it right. That's a whole different kettle of fish right there. And it would have brought a whole lot more resistance that we didn't need at that time. And I tell you that story to say this. It's possible the Space Force may need to be in a different department one day. I don't see that in the near future. It's possible that one day you may see the space activities of the IC community merged with the Space Force. Both of those, I think, are a ways off before we need to start thinking about that. But those things are possible down the road, but I don't see either one of them in the foreseeable future.
All right. We are going to wrap up on time. As the chairman of HASC, you have continued a legacy of passing a bipartisan NDAA for the past 64 years. You've spearheaded the establishment of the newest branches of the Armed Service. You've solidified your place in history, quite frankly, as an innovator, a hard worker, and a principled, effective legislator.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Guardian Total Force, I just want to say thank you for your enduring optimism. It is rare to have in Washington, D.C., somebody who is principled, educated, and optimistic in a position of power. On behalf of myself, on behalf of my husband and my children and my family, thank you for being an amazing mentor, an amazing friend, a boss, and being there for me in some of my darkest hours.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a 15-minute break. Please talk amongst yourselves. Thank you.